Mom, put this on. My daughter Jessica tossed a gray housekeeper's uniform onto my bed like I was just another employee. Mrs. Henderson is coming for brunch tomorrow, and I can't have her thinking I'm running some kind of charity case here. I stared at the polyester fabric, my hands shaking, not from age, but from the realization that my own daughter saw me as nothing more than hired help, the same daughter I'd given everything to save. What she didn't know was that while she thought she held all the cards, I'd been quietly collecting a few of my own. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Let me tell you how I ended up holding a housekeeper's uniform in the bedroom that used to be my craft room, because this story didn't start with betrayal, it started with love. My name is Margaret, but everyone has always called me Maggie. For 43 years, I was married to Robert, a good man who worked construction and never missed a day until his heart gave out at 68. We raised Jessica together in a modest three-bedroom house on Maple Street that we bought in 1981 for $32,000. By the time Robert passed, that house was worth nearly $400,000, and it was all we had to show for a lifetime of work, sacrifice, and love. I was proud of that house. I was proud of the garden where I grew tomatoes every summer, proud of the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, proud of the living room where Jessica had done our homework at the coffee table Robert built with his own hands. I was 71 years old, and for the first time in my life, I owned something outright. No mortgage, no debt, just me and my memories and enough money in savings to live comfortably for the rest of my days. Jessica had always been challenging. Even as a child, she had this way of making you feel like you owed her something. When other kids got participation trophies, she demanded the first place ribbon. When her friends got new bikes, she needed a better one. Robert used to joke that she came out of the womb with her hand extended, expecting the world to fill it. But she was our only child, and after Robert died, she was all I had left. Jessica was 38 when the call came that changed everything. I remember it was a Tuesday evening in March, and I was watching my shows when the phone rang. "Mom, I need help." Her voice was different, small, scared, nothing like the confident woman who usually spoke to me like I was interrupting something important. Derek left me. Derek was her husband of 8 years, a successful accountant who drove a BMW and took Jessica on expensive vacations. I'd never particularly liked him. He had cold eyes and talked about money too much, but he provided the lifestyle Jessica felt she deserved. "He emptied our business account, Mom. The catering company. It's gone. Everything's gone." Jessica had started a high-end catering business 3 years earlier, the kind that charged $800 to serve finger foods at garden parties for people with more money than sense. She'd been so proud of it, constantly posting photos on Facebook of elaborate cheese boards and champagne towers. "How much do you need, sweetheart?" I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to see paperwork, talked to lawyers, understood exactly what had happened. But when your child is crying on the phone at 10 o'clock at night, maternal instinct overrides common sense. 50,000 to cover the debts and start over. "I know it's a lot, but I'll pay you back, Mom, every penny. You know I'm good for it." $50,000. It was more than half of my savings, money I'd planned to stretch for the next 20 years. But it was my daughter and she was desperate and I loved her. I took out a cashier's check the next morning. But 50,000 wasn't enough. There were legal fees when Derek's creditors came after the business assets. There was rent for a new apartment when Jessica couldn't afford the mortgage on the house she'd shared with Derek. There were living expenses while she got back on her feet. Within 6 months, I'd given her $87,000, nearly everything I had. "Mom, I hate asking, but could you help with just one more thing?" The one more thing was 25,000 to buy equipment for her new catering venture. To get it, I had to sell the house on Maple Street. I'll never forget signing those papers. 42 years of memories reduced to a legal document. Also, Jessica could have another chance at the success she'd grown up believing she deserved. The realtor, a kind woman named Patricia, kept asking if I was sure. It's a lot of money to give to a family member, she said gently. Have you considered a formal loan arrangement? I'd brushed off her concerns. Jessica was my daughter. Family didn't need contracts. I moved into a small apartment across town, keeping only the furniture that would fit and donating the rest to charity. Jessica had promised it was temporary, just until she got established again. She'd buy me a beautiful condo, she said, somewhere with a pool and a community garden where I could make new friends. The catering business took off faster than anyone expected. Within a year, Jessica was booking high-profile events, charging premium prices, building the kind of success she'd always dreamed of. She bought a stunning 4-bedroom house in Riverside Estates, the kind of neighborhood where HOA fees cost more than most people's rent. I waited for the call about my condo. Instead, I got a different call on a Thursday afternoon. Mom, I've been thinking. You're all alone in that apartment, and I have all this space. Why don't you come live with me? It'll be like having a built-in grandmother for when I have kids someday. It sounded perfect. After a lifetime of taking care of others, someone would finally take care of me. I should have known better. The first few months were lovely. Jessica cooked elaborate dinners and we watched movies together, and she seemed genuinely happy to have me there. I helped around the house, but it felt natural, the way family helps each other. But gradually, things changed. The requests became expectations. The gratitude became entitlement. The woman who had cried on the phone begging for help became someone who sighed heavily when I asked to use her car for a doctor's appointment. I have that meeting at 3. Can you work something out for the appointment? When I mentioned that I was running low on my prescription medication and needed to pick up refills, she handed me a $20 bill. Here, this should cover it, but maybe next time you could get the generic versions. They're just as good and money's tight right now. Money was not tight. I knew this because I'd seen her credit card bills accidentally left on the kitchen counter. She'd spent $600 at Nordstrom the week she told me money was tight. But the moment I really understood my situation was when her friend Caroline came for lunch, and I overheard their conversation from the kitchen where I was cleaning up. Your house is always so spotless, Jess. Do you have a service?
Oh, that's just my mom. She loves keeping busy, and it gives her a sense of purpose. You know how old people get when they don't have anything to do. My hands had stopped moving as I listened to my daughter describe me like I was a pet she kept occupied with chores. That's so sweet of you to let her help. I can barely get my mother to water my plants when I'm out of town. Well, she's living here rent free, so it's the least she can do, right? Rent free. As if the $112,000 I'd given her didn't count as rent. As if selling my home to fund her dreams didn't earn me a place at her table. But I'd smiled and brought out the sandwiches and pretended I hadn't heard anything. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of gradually becoming less like a mother and more like unpaid staff. 2 years of watching Jessica build the life I'd financed while treating me like an inconvenience. And now, staring at the gray uniform she'd thrown at me like I was beneath her notice, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. Jessica hadn't rescued me from loneliness by inviting me to live with her. She'd simply found a way to get live-in help without paying for it. But what my entitled daughter didn't know was that all those months of being invisible had taught me to see everything. Every phone call she thought I couldn't hear, every document she left carelessly on her desk, every conversation with lawyers and accountants she assumed was over my head. She thought she was so clever, keeping me dependent and grateful. She had no idea that while I was folding her laundry and scrubbing her floors, I'd been learning exactly how she'd built her long. By the end of the first month, we'd settled into what felt like a natural routine. I'd wake up early and have coffee ready when Jessica came downstairs. I'd tidy up the kitchen while she got ready for work, maybe start something in the slow cooker for dinner. She'd call me around lunchtime to see how my day was going, asking if I needed anything from the store. "You're the best roommate I've ever had," she joked one afternoon. "The house has never looked better, and I'm eating actual home cooked meals instead of takeout. You're spoiling me." I loved being needed again. I loved feeling useful. When you reach my age, the world has a way of making you feel invisible, like your contributions don't matter anymore. But here was my daughter, successful and independent, still wanting her mother around. On weekends, we'd work in her garden together. Jessica had bought the house for its potential, but she'd never had time to actually tend to the landscaping. I spent hours planning flower beds and vegetable patches, researching which plants would thrive in her soil conditions. "You have such a green thumb, Mom," she said one Saturday afternoon, watching me plant tulip bulbs for the spring. I could never keep anything alive. We drove to the nursery together that day, filling her SUV with bags of mulch and flats of petunias. She insisted on buying me a wide-brimmed gardening hat and a new pair of gloves, brushing off my protests about the expense. "It's the least I can do," she said, kissing my cheek at the checkout counter. "You're turning this place into paradise." The garden became my pride and joy that summer. Every morning, I'd take my coffee outside and walk among the flowers, deadheading roses and pulling weeds before the day got too hot. Neighbors would stop to compliment the transformation, and Jessica would beam with pride. "My mother has magic hands," she'd tell them. "I'm so lucky to have her here." I felt lucky too. Jessica's friends started coming around more often, and she seemed genuinely proud to introduce me. At her 4th of July barbecue, I spent the afternoon in the kitchen preparing side dishes while she grilled burgers on the deck. Her friend Miranda, a real estate agent with perfectly styled hair and designer everything, kept me company while I made potato salad. "Jessica is so fortunate to have you here," Miranda said, sampling my coleslaw. "My mother lives in Florida, and I see her maybe twice a year. I always feel guilty about it." "Family is everything," I told her, arranging deviled eggs on a platter. "I'm just grateful Jessica wanted me close." When Miranda left that evening, she hugged me goodbye. "Mrs. Margaret, you're a treasure. Jessica better be taking good care of you." "She is," I assured her, and I meant it. But even then, there were small moments that should have warned me. Like when Jessica's business partner, David, stopped by one afternoon while I was watering the front flower beds. "You must be Jessica's mother," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Coleman. Jess has told me so much about you." We chatted for a few minutes about the garden, and he complimented the roses I'd coaxed into a second bloom. When Jessica came to the door to greet him, I heard her say, "Sorry about that. Mom gets a little chatty with strangers." It was said lightly, with a laugh, but something about it stung. I wasn't being chatty. I was being polite to her business partner. But I pushed the feeling away. Jessica was probably just eager to discuss work with David. There were other small moments, too. The way she checked her phone while I was telling her about my day. How she'd suggest I might be more comfortable eating dinner in front of the TV instead of at the dining room table when she had work calls to make. Mom, you know I need the car for work, she'd say with that patient tone people use with children. Can't you just take an Uber? An Uber to Dr. Henderson's office would cost $25 each way. On my limited income, what was left after helping Jessica, $50 for a routine checkup felt extravagant. But I didn't want to seem ungrateful or needy, so I'd reschedule appointments for days when she didn't need the car. The real turning point came in early September, almost 4 months after I'd moved in. Jessica was hosting a dinner party for some potential clients, something about catering a corporate retreat, and she'd asked me to help with the preparation. I spent all day cooking herb crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, a chocolate tart that required 3 hours of careful attention. The dining room looked elegant with the good china and cloth napkins, fresh flowers from the garden as centerpieces. When the guests arrived, I retreated to the kitchen as Jessica had suggested, cleaning up while she entertained. But the kitchen shared a wall with the dining room, and voices carry more than people realize. This salmon is incredible, Jessica. Who's your caterer? Oh, I did all the cooking myself. It's just something I love to do. I stood frozen at the sink, my hands still sudsy from washing wine glasses. She was taking credit for my work I'd done out of love, wanting to help her succeed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came an hour later when the same man asked to use the restroom and wandered into the kitchen by mistake.
Oh, excuse me, he said, looking embarrassed. I was looking for the bathroom. Down the hall, second door, I told him kindly, drying my hands on a towel. You must be the help, he said. Wonderful meal tonight. Jessica is lucky to have found you. I started to correct him, to explain that I was Jessica's mother, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he'd said, the help, like it was perfectly natural for someone like me to be invisible in someone like Jessica's house. Thank you, I said instead, watching him walk away. When I heard Jessica's laugh from the dining room a moment later, bright and careless, I realized something had fundamentally changed between us. Or maybe it had never been what I thought it was in the first place. That night, after the guests left and Jessica went to bed without so much as a thank you for the meal, I sat in the garden I'd planted and tried to understand what was happening to us. The roses I'd coaxed into bloom were still beautiful in the moonlight, but they looked different somehow, like they belonged to someone else now, someone who might not even notice when they needed tending. I should have seen it then, the way Jessica had let a stranger assume I was hired help without correcting him, the way she'd claimed my cooking as her own, the way she'd started treating my contributions as services rather than gifts. But love makes you blind to the truth, even when it's right in front of you, blooming in a garden you planted with your own hands for someone who's already forgotten what you sacrificed to be there. The changes after that dinner party were so gradual, I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Maybe Jessica was just busy with work. Maybe I was being too sensitive. After all, running a successful catering business was stressful, and she'd always been driven when it came to her career. The first thing I noticed was how our evening routines began to shift. Instead of watching movies together on the couch, Jessica started taking calls in her office after dinner, emerging hours later when I was already getting ready for bed. Sorry, Mom, she'd say, barely looking up from her phone. Big event this weekend. You know how it is. I did know how it was. I'd raised her after all, and Jessica had never been one to do anything halfway. So I adjusted. Instead of waiting for her to finish work, I'd prepare a plate and leave it in the refrigerator with a note. Instead of our long conversations over coffee in the morning, I'd have breakfast ready when she rushed through the kitchen, keys in hand. You're such a lifesaver, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you. Those words still warmed my heart, even if they came more and more rarely. October brought Jessica's biggest contract yet, a week-long corporate retreat for a tech company with more money than most small countries. The preparation consumed her completely, and I found myself taking on more of the household responsibilities without being asked. It seemed natural. She was building something important, and I wanted to support her success. The house looks amazing, she said one evening, glancing around the spotless living room where I'd spent the afternoon polishing furniture and arranging fresh flowers from the garden. You really don't have to do so much, you know. But there was something in her tone that suggested she expected it to stay that way. And honestly, I didn't mind. Keeping busy made me feel useful, and seeing Jessica's business thrive filled me with the same pride I'd felt when she'd brought home good report cards as a child. The corporate retreat was a massive success. Jessica came home that Friday night practically glowing, a bottle of expensive champagne in her hand and stories about executives raving over her menu. Jessica, we need to celebrate, she announced, popping the cork in the kitchen. This contract alone will cover my overhead for 6 months. We toasted to her success at the dining room table, and for a moment it felt like old times. Jessica was animated and grateful, telling me how she'd thought of me when the client complimented her chocolate tart, the same recipe I'd taught her years ago. I couldn't have done any of this without you, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Moving in here was the best decision you ever made. I felt a familiar flutter of happiness in my chest. This was my daughter, the woman I raised to be strong and successful. The distance I'd been feeling was just stress, just the natural growing pains of building a business. But even that night, there were small things that nagged at me, like how Jessica assumed I would clean up the champagne glasses and dinner dishes while she made phone calls to share her good news, or how she mentioned, almost casually, that she told the client the chocolate tart was a family recipe without specifying that it was her mother's family recipe. Small things, probably meaningless. November arrived with an unexpected complication. Brad Morrison, a divorced father of two who owned a wine distribution company and had been pursuing Jessica since the summer. She'd been resistant to dating anyone seriously, too focused on work, she said. But Brad was persistent in a charming way that even I found endearing. He started coming by the house more frequently, bringing flowers for Jessica and always including a small bouquet for me. He was polite and warm, the kind of man who pulled out chairs and asked genuine questions about my garden. Mrs. Margaret, Jessica tells me that you're responsible for this incredible landscaping, he said one Sunday afternoon, walking with me through the backyard while Jessica took a work call inside. My ex-wife hired professional landscapers and never got results like this. I found myself looking forward to Brad's visits. He treated me like Jessica's mother, not like furniture that happened to be in the room. When he stayed for dinner, he complimented my cooking and insisted on helping with dishes, despite Jessica's protests that it wasn't necessary. "Brad, you're a guest," Jessica would say, but he'd wave her off. "Mrs. Margaret cooked this incredible meal. The least I can do is help clean up." Those evenings felt like family again, the three of us talking and laughing around the dinner table. Brad would tell stories about his kids, Emma 8 and Jake 10, and I'd share memories of raising Jessica. He seemed genuinely interested in my perspective, asking follow-up questions and remembering details from previous conversations. But I began to notice how Jessica's attitude toward me shifted when Brad was around versus when we were alone. In front of him, she was the dutiful, grateful daughter, praising my cooking and thanking me for keeping the house so beautiful. When it was just us, she was distracted and increasingly critical of small things.
Mom, did you use the good towels in the guest bathroom again? Those are for special occasions. The grocery bill seemed high this week. Maybe we should stick to the basics. Could you try to keep your gardening tools in the garage? The porch looks cluttered. I started second guessing myself constantly. Had I always used those towels? Was I spending too much on groceries? Were my gardening tools really creating clutter, or was Jessica just stressed? The words hit me like a physical blow. Stay in my room? During a party in the house where I lived? Serving food I'd prepared? Surrounded by decorations I'd arranged? Of course, I heard myself say, though my voice sounded strange and distant. I understand completely. And I did understand, in a way that made my chest tight with recognition. I understood that I was an embarrassment to the image Jessica wanted to project. I understood that successful businesswomen in their late 30s didn't live with their mothers and certainly didn't want those mothers visible when trying to impress clients. I understood that in Jessica's mind, I'd already transitioned from family member to household staff, and household staff stayed invisible during important events. I spent that evening in my bedroom, surrounded by my modest Christmas decorations, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting up from the living room. The party was clearly a success. I could hear the enthusiastic responses to the food I'd prepared, the compliments on the beautifully appointed house I had spent days perfecting. Around 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Brad standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable and slightly embarrassed. Mrs. Margaret, I was wondering where you were, he said quietly. I brought something for you. He handed me a small wrapped package and a card. Inside was a beautiful ornament, a silver angel with delicate filigree wings, and a note that read, "For someone who makes every house feel like home. Merry Christmas, Brad." I felt tears prick my eyes, both from his kindness and from the contrast with my daughter's behavior. Thank you, I whispered. This is beautiful. Jessica said you weren't feeling well tonight, he continued, his brow furrowed with concern. Is there anything I can bring you? Some food from downstairs? Jessica had told him I was sick. Rather than explaining that she'd asked me to stay hidden, she'd created a lie that painted me as frail and unwell. It was a small cruelty wrapped in false consideration, and somehow that made it worse than outright meanness. I'm fine, I assured him. Just tired. You should get back to the party. Brad studied my face for a long moment, and I had the distinct feeling he saw more than Jessica had given him credit for. If you're sure, he said finally. But, Mrs. Margaret, you are always welcome at any gathering I'm part of. I hope you know that. After he left, I hung his angel ornament on the garland around my mirror and sat on the edge of my bed listening to my daughter's party continue without me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was surrounded by the sounds of a successful evening I'd made possible, celebrating accomplishments I'd helped fund, in a house I'd helped maintain, while being deliberately excluded from the joy I'd helped create. That night, I lay awake long after the last guest had left and Jessica had gone to bed, thinking about the difference between being needed and being valued. I was definitely needed for cooking, cleaning, maintaining the perfect home that impressed Jessica's clients and friends. But valued? Valued as a person worthy of respect and inclusion? The question hung in the darkness above my bed like a weight I wasn't ready to carry. But sometimes the heaviest truths are the ones we need most to acknowledge, even when we're not yet strong enough to act on them. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, surrounded by my small rebellion of Christmas lights and memories, I felt something beginning to crystallize in my mind. Not anger exactly, but a growing understanding that love shouldn't require invisibility. The angel Brad had given me caught the moonlight from my window, casting small shadows that danced on the wall like promises I wasn't ready to make to myself yet. But they were there, those shadows, waiting for me to be brave enough to step into them. The new year arrived without fanfare in Jessica's house. While neighbors set off fireworks and made resolutions, I spent New Year's Eve reorganizing Jessica's pantry, a task she had mentioned needed doing when I had time. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, starting another year of my life by organizing someone else's canned goods while they celebrated with friends I wasn't invited to meet. Brad had asked Jessica to bring me to his New Year's Eve party, mentioning it twice in my presence. Both times, Jessica had deflected with vague comments about my preferring quiet evenings and not being much of a party person. She had gotten quite good at speaking for me, I'd noticed, always in ways that painted my isolation as my own choice rather than her preference. January brought what Jessica called the reorganization phase of her business. She was expanding, hiring 2 full-time employees and renting a commercial kitchen space. It was exciting news, the kind of success any mother should celebrate. But her success seemed to come with an inverse relationship to my status in her household. "Mom, I need to talk to you about some changes," she said one morning over coffee, though I noticed she had stopped sitting down for our morning conversations months ago. Now she stood by the counter, scrolling through emails while delivering what felt like management updates. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind?" "Well, with the business expanding, I'm going to be entertaining clients here more often. Important clients. And I think we need to establish some clearer boundaries about space and schedules." Boundaries. The word felt clinical, like something you'd discuss with a problematic tenant rather than your own mother. Jessica pulled out a typed list. When had she found time to type a list? And began reading what sounded suspiciously like house rules. "So, I'll need the living room and dining room to stay presentation ready at all times. That means no personal items left out, no books or magazines on the coffee table, things like that." I nodded, though I wondered when my reading glasses on the side table had become a problem. "And when I'm working from home, I'll need quiet in the main areas. Maybe you could do your phone calls and television watching in your bedroom." My phone calls, as if I were some chatty teenager tying up the line instead of a 73-year-old woman who talked to her doctor's office and occasionally called her friend Helen. "The kitchen will need to be available for my use during business hours, 9 to 5. So if you could do your cooking and meal prep outside those times, that would be perfect." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Jessica, when am I supposed to eat lunch?" She looked up from her list with the patient expression she used when I asked her questions she found tedious. "Mom, you're perfectly capable of making a sandwich or heating up leftovers. I just need the space clear for when I'm preparing samples or hosting tastings." The space. My daughter was now referring to the kitchen where I prepared all her meals as the space that needed to be kept clear of my presence. "And one more thing," she continued, folding the list and sliding it across the counter toward me. "I'm going to need you to be a little more discreet when Brad comes over. He's been asking about you a lot, and I think he's getting the wrong idea about our living situation." "What kind of wrong idea?" Jessica's cheek flushed slightly, the way it had when she was caught in lies as a child. "He seems to think you're some kind of guest here, that I'm taking care of you out of obligation or something. It's embarrassing, Mom. I don't want him thinking I can't manage my own life." The word hung between us like a slap. I was an embarrassment. My presence in her home, funded by my own life savings, was something she needed to manage and contain. "What would you like me to do?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Just when he's here, could you maybe stay busy in other parts of the house? Let me handle the hosting. He doesn't need to know all our family business." Our family business. As if love and gratitude and taking care of your widowed mother were secrets to be hidden from a potential romantic partner. I agreed to her list because what choice did I have? But that night, I read through her typed rules again and realized I was looking at something that resembled an employee handbook more than a conversation between family members. The changes took effect immediately. I found myself tiptoeing around my own living situation, constantly aware of where I was allowed to be and when. If Jessica was in the kitchen preparing samples, I'd wait in my bedroom until she was finished, even if it meant eating lunch at 3 in the afternoon. When I heard her business call starting, I'd quickly gather any personal items I'd left in common areas, erasing evidence of my existence like a guilty secret. The most painful part was how normal it began to feel. Within weeks, I'd internalized Jessica's rules so completely that I felt genuinely apologetic when she found me reading in the living room during what I'd forgotten were her business hours. "Sorry, sweetheart," I'd say, scrambling to collect my book and reading glasses. I lost track of time. "It's fine, Mom. Just try to remember," she'd reply with the weary patience of someone managing a forgetful employee. February brought a new development that changed the household dynamic even further. Jessica hired a housekeeper. "Mom, I know you've been doing so much to keep the house nice, but with business picking up, I think we need professional help," she explained, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't really about my capabilities. "I don't mind taking care of the house," I said, confused. "It gives me something to do." "I know, but Maria is bonded and insured, and she has professional experience with high-end homes. Some of my clients are pretty particular about these things." Maria Gonzalez was a lovely woman in her 50s who spoke limited English but had an extraordinary eye for detail. She came twice a week, efficiently transforming Jessica's house into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. What I didn't expect was how her presence would further diminish my role in the household. "Mom, could you maybe coordinate with Maria about cleaning schedules? I don't want you two getting in each other's way." Coordinate. As if I were another member of Jessica's household staff rather than her mother who had sacrificed everything to help her daughter succeed. I agreed to her list because what choice did I have? But that night, I read through her typed rules again and realized I was looking at something that resembled an employee handbook more than a conversation between family members. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. Jessica had effectively replaced me with Maria, but couldn't get rid of me because I had nowhere else to go. So she'd simply redefined my role from family member to unpaid, live-in help who happened to share my DNA. That evening, I sat in my bedroom, surrounded by Christmas decorations I still hadn't taken down, my small act of rebellion that seemed increasingly important. And I tried to understand how I'd gotten to this point. How had I gone from being Jessica's beloved mother to being someone she needed to hide from her boyfriend and coordinate with her housekeeper? The answer, when it came, was simple and devastating. Gradually, then all at once. Each small accommodation I'd made, each boundary I'd accepted, each time I'd swallowed my hurt feelings and told myself Jessica was just stressed. It had all been building toward this moment when I could finally see the complete picture of what my life had become. I wasn't living with my daughter. I was living in my daughter's house, subject to her rules, dependent on her tolerance, invisible, except when my services were required. And the most painful part was that I'd participated in my own diminishment, making myself smaller and quieter and less troublesome until I'd practically disappeared altogether. But sometimes the most important discoveries come when we're finally ready to see what's been in front of us all along. And as I sat there in the glow of my Christmas lights, holding Brad's angel ornament in my hands, I felt something shifting inside me that hadn't moved in months. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't a plan. It was simply the recognition that being grateful for shelter shouldn't require the surrender of dignity, and that love, real love, doesn't ask you to become invisible to prove you deserve it. March arrived with an unseasonable warmth that coaxed the bulbs I'd planted last fall into early bloom. From my bedroom window, I could see daffodils pushing through the mulch in Jessica's garden. My garden, really, though I'd stopped thinking of it that way. The sight of those bright yellow faces should have lifted my spirits, but instead they served as a reminder of how much had changed since I'd knelt in that same soil, planning for a spring I'd imagined sharing with my daughter. Now I barely went outside except to retrieve the mail or take out the trash, careful to time my movements around Jessica's schedule and her clients' visits. I'd become a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life, and the daffodils blooming without my care felt like a metaphor I wasn't ready to examine too closely. It was during one of these carefully timed mail retrievals that I encountered our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd moved in next door shortly after Jessica bought the house. "Margaret," she called out, waving from her front porch where she was watering hanging baskets of petunias. "I haven't seen you in ages. How are you settling into retired life?" I walked over to the fence that separated our properties, grateful for human conversation that wasn't filtered through Jessica's rules about appropriate timing and location. "I'm doing well, thank you. Your flowers look beautiful."
Oh, these are nothing compared to what you did with Jessica's yard last year. I kept meaning to ask you for gardening advice, but you seemed so busy. Are you still working on the landscaping? The question caught me off guard. I realized I hadn't touched Jessica's garden in months, not since Maria had started coming and Jessica had mentioned that professional landscaping might be more consistent with the neighborhood standards. Not so much anymore, I said carefully. Jessica's been having professionals handle most of the outdoor work. Mrs. Chen frowned slightly. That's a shame. You had such a gift for it. My husband always said you were out there at dawn working with those roses like you were conducting an orchestra. She was right. I had gotten up early to garden, finding peace in the quiet morning hours when the world felt like it belonged just to me and the plants. When had I stopped doing that? When had I allowed Jessica's schedule to dictate even my relationship with soil and sunlight? Maybe I'll get back to it, I said, though the words felt like a lie even as I spoke them. You should. And Margaret, Mrs. Chen leaned closer to the fence, if you ever want to come over for tea, you're always welcome. I know it can get lonely when the children are so busy with their careers. Her kindness was so unexpected that my felt tears prick my eyes. Thank you. That sounds lovely. As I walked back toward the house, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Chen's perspective on my situation. To her, I was simply a retired mother whose successful daughter was busy with her career. She'd seen me as someone with agency, someone who chose to garden in the early morning hours because I loved it, not because I was restricted to times when I wouldn't interfere with more important activities. When had I stopped seeing myself that way? That afternoon, while Jessica was at her commercial kitchen and Maria wasn't scheduled to come, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went into Jessica's office. I told myself I was looking for a phone charger, but that wasn't entirely true. Something about my conversation with Mrs. Chen had awakened a curiosity I'd been suppressing for weeks. Jessica's casual references to her business success, her mentions of major contracts and expansion plans, her ability to afford both Maria and professional landscaping, all of it seemed to suggest a level of prosperity that didn't quite match her constant reminders about money being tight. The office had once been a formal dining room, but Jessica had converted it when she started working from home more frequently.
Her desk was a sleek glass affair that looked expensive, surrounded by filing cabinets and shelves lined with business books and awards from industry organizations. I wasn't snooping, I told myself. I was just, well, looking for that phone charger in the desk drawers. The first drawer contained the usual office supplies: pens, paper clips, sticky notes. The second drawer held files labeled with client names and event dates. But the third drawer, the deep one on the bottom right, contained something that made my breath catch in my throat: financial documents, bank statements, tax returns, business profit and loss reports, all neatly organized in labeled folders. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that even as my hands reached for the folder marked Personal Banking 2024. But sometimes the need to understand your own life overrides conventional boundaries, especially when you suspect those boundaries have been erected to keep you in the dark about your own circumstances. Jessica's personal banking statements told a story that contradicted everything she'd been telling me about tight money and careful budgeting. Her checking account showed regular deposits that were substantially larger than what I'd understood her business to be generating. Her savings account balance made my pre-Jessica nest egg look modest by comparison. But it was the investment account statements that truly stunned me. Jessica had over $400,000 in various mutual funds and stock investments. $400,000. More money than I'd ever had in my entire life, accumulated in just the 3 years since I'd helped her rebuild her business. I sat back in her expensive desk chair, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't the financial picture of someone who needed to be careful about grocery budgets or who couldn't afford to have their elderly mother occasionally use the kitchen during business hours. This was the portfolio of someone who was not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. My hands shaking slightly, I opened another folder marked Business Financials. If Jessica's personal wealth was surprising, her business success was staggering. Catering contracts were tens of thousands of dollars, corporate accounts that generated monthly retainers, a client list that read like a who's who of the city's most exclusive organizations. She hadn't just recovered from Derek's betrayal and her business collapse, she'd built something far more successful than anything she'd had before. Built it, in large part, using the foundation I'd provided with my life savings and the sale of my home. But what truly made my stomach clench with understanding was a document near the bottom of the stack: a real estate inquiry from a high-end retirement community called Sunset Manor. The inquiry was dated just 2 weeks ago. Jessica had been researching assisted living facilities that cost upwards of $6,000 per month, facilities that were described in the brochures as providing dignified care for seniors who value independence and privacy. I read the marketing materials with growing comprehension. Sunset Manor wasn't presented as a place for people who couldn't take care of themselves. It was marketed as a luxury option for affluent seniors who wanted social activities, meals prepared by professional chefs, and freedom from the responsibilities of home ownership. Jessica wasn't researching nursing homes for some hypothetical future need. She was planning to move me out of her house and into assisted living, despite having the financial means to support me comfortably and the moral obligation to honor the fact that I'd funded her current success. I carefully returned everything to its proper place and left the office exactly as I'd found it. But as I walked back to my bedroom, I found myself carrying with me a revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about my situation. Jessica wasn't struggling financially and keeping me around out of necessity. She wasn't gradually becoming more distant because of business stress or the natural challenges of multi-generational living. She was systematically preparing to remove me from her life while maintaining complete control over the timeline and circumstances. The rules, the boundaries, the replacement with Maria, the efforts to hide my existence from Brad, minimize my presence until my complete absence would seem natural and inevitable. And she was doing all of this while sitting on a fortune that included substantial returns on the investment of my life savings. That evening, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and feeling something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. The cold clarity that comes when you finally understand exactly where you stand in someone else's calculations. I wasn't Jessica's beloved mother who'd sacrificed everything to help her succeed. I was a problem she was managing, an inconvenience she was planning to relocate, a reminder of dependence and obligation that didn't fit the image of success she wanted to project. But what Jessica didn't realize was all those months of being treated like invisible household help had given me something valuable: the ability to observe without being noticed, to listen without being heard, to understand the full scope of someone's plans while they assumed I was too old, too grateful, or too dependent to see clearly. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking about those daffodils blooming in the garden I'd planted. They'd push through the soil and mulch not because someone tended them daily, but because they had deep roots and stored energy and an innate understanding of when the time was right to emerge. Some things can't be buried forever, no matter how much soil you pile on top of them.
The knowledge I'd gained from Jessica's office sat inside me like a seed, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. For 3 days after my discovery, I moved through the house exactly as I had before, following her rules, staying invisible during business hours, coordinating with Maria about cleaning schedules. But everything had changed because now I understood that my compliance wasn't kindness or gratitude, it was performance art. Jessica thought she was managing a dependent, elderly mother who had nowhere else to go and no choice but to accept whatever scraps of dignity she was willing to provide. She had no idea she was actually living with someone who now knew exactly how much her tight budget was worth and what her long term plans looked like. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the diminished version of Margaret that Jessica had been cultivating, but the woman who'd raised a child, managed a household through decades of financial challenges, and made the kind of hard decisions that life requires. The woman who'd survived Robert's death and found the strength to sell the house we'd built together when someone I loved needed help. That woman had never been stupid or naive. She'd simply been trusting. On Saturday morning, while Jessica was at her commercial kitchen prepping for a wedding, I made a phone call I should have made months ago. Helen, it's Maggie. I know it's been too long. Helen Kowalski had been my closest friend for over 30 years. We'd raised our children together, survived the challenges of empty nests and widowhood, and maintained the kind of friendship that picks up where it left off, even after periods of silence. Helen! I was just thinking about you yesterday. How are you, honey? How's the new living situation working out with Jessica? I'd been dreading that question, but now it felt like an opening I'd been hoping for. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Do you have time for coffee this week? Maybe we could meet at that little place on Elm Street? Of course. Is everything all right? You sound different. I'm fine, Helen. I just need to talk to someone who's known me longer than 5 minutes. We arranged to meet Tuesday afternoon during Jessica's business hours when I was supposed to be staying quiet in my bedroom anyway. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally breaking one of Jessica's rules in order to reconnect with my own life. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp April weather that made everything feel possible. I chose my outfit carefully, not the comfortable old clothes I'd been wearing around the house, but a nice blouse and slacks that reminded me I was a person who existed in the world beyond Jessica's walls. The cafe on Elm Street was exactly as I remembered: worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and the kind of comfortable shabbiness that made conversation easy. Helen was already there when I arrived, looking wonderful in a bright purple sweater that complemented her silver hair. Maggie, you look, pause,
studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd known me long enough to see past surface pleasantries. "You look like you've been carrying something heavy." That simple observation nearly undid me. When was the last time someone had really looked at me and seen what I was experiencing? "I think I've made a terrible mistake," I said, settling into the chair across from her. For the next hour, I told Helen everything. Not the sanitized version I might have shared months ago when I was still making excuses for Jessica, but the truth. The gradual erosion of boundaries, the rules and restrictions, the way I'd been systematically made invisible in my own living situation. Helen listened without interrupting, but I could see her expression growing more troubled with each detail I shared. And the worst part, I concluded, is that I let it happen. Every step of the way, I told myself she was just busy, just stressed, just trying to build her business. I made myself smaller and smaller until I practically disappeared. "Maggie," Helen said firmly, "you didn't let anything happen. You responded to manipulation with love and trust, which is what good mothers do. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" I told her about the financial documents, about Jessica's wealth and the assisted living brochures, and the realization that everything I'd been told about tight budgets and necessary sacrifices was a carefully constructed lie. Helen's expression shifted from sympathy to something harder. "$400,000, she repeated slowly. "And she's been making you feel guilty about using her kitchen during the day?" "I think she wants me gone, Helen. I think she's just been managing the timeline, making it seem gradual and natural instead of sudden and cruel." "Of course she wants you gone," Helen said bluntly. "You're a witness to how her success was built. You represent everything she'd rather forget about needing help, about not being completely self-made." Helen reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "But Maggie, you're not gone yet, and you're not powerless. You just need to remember who you were before Jessica convinced you to become someone smaller." After we parted ways, I drove around town for an hour, thinking about Helen's words. She was right. I had allowed myself to become someone smaller, but that didn't mean I had to stay that way. When I finally returned to Jessica's house, I felt different. Not angry exactly, but clear. Clear about what I'd observed, what I knew, and what I needed to do next. That evening, Jessica came home excited about a potential contract with the city's largest law firm, a monthly catering arrangement that would, in her words, set us up for years. Us, as if I was a partner in her success rather than the mother she was planning to relocate to assisted living. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said and meant it. I was genuinely proud of Jessica's business acumen, even as I now understood how she was using that success against me. "It means I'll be working even longer hours for the next few weeks, trying to nail down the details. I hope you understand if I'm even more unavailable than usual." "Of course, you do what you need to do." She looked surprised by my easy agreement, but not suspicious. Why would she be? I was just her accommodating, invisible mother, grateful for whatever attention she had time to spare. What Jessica didn't realize was that her increased absence would give me something I'd been needing: time and privacy to make some calls of my own. That night, I sat in my decorated bedroom and made a list of things I needed to understand better. Financial advisors I might consult about investment options for someone my age. Legal resources for elderly people who felt taken advantage of by family members. Organizations that help seniors navigate complex family dynamics. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning education. Because if there's one thing that 73 years of life had taught me, It's that knowledge is power, and power is most effective when it's wielded by someone nobody suspects of having it.
At the bottom of my list, I wrote one more item: contact Robert's nephew, Jim, attorney specializing in elder law. I hadn't spoken to Jim since Robert's funeral, but I remembered him saying that family members sometimes needed legal protection from other family members and that the law had provisions for situations where elderly people's resources were being misused. I wasn't sure yet what constituted misuse in my situation, but I was beginning to suspect that living rent free in a house purchased with someone's life savings while systematically stripping them of dignity might qualify. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror above my dresser, surrounded by the Christmas decorations I still hadn't taken down. For the first time in months, the woman looking back at me didn't seem defeated or diminished. She looked like someone who was getting ready to remember what she was capable of. The angel ornament from Brad caught the lamplight, casting its familiar shadows on the wall. But tonight, those shadows didn't look like promises I wasn't ready to make. They looked like plans beginning to take shape, like possibilities I was finally strong enough to consider. Jessica wanted to manage the timeline of my departure from her life. She wanted to control the narrative, make it seem like assisted living was a natural choice rather than an expensive way to remove an inconvenient reminder of how her success was truly built. But what she didn't know was that while she'd been planning my exit, I'd been learning to see clearly again. And clear sight, it turns out, is the first requirement for strategic thinking. Some seeds wait years for the right conditions to grow, but when they finally do, they can push through concrete. The law offices of Morrison and Associates occupied the entire third floor of a downtown building that spoke of old money and established power. Robert's nephew Jim had inherited his practice from his father and built it into one of the city's most respected elder law firms. When I called to schedule an appointment, his secretary had been warm and accommodating, though I could hear the surprise in her voice when I mentioned being Robert's widow. "Mrs. Margaret, Jim speaks of you and Robert so fondly. I'm sure he'll be delighted to see you again." I'd chosen to meet with Jim on a Thursday afternoon when Jessica was conducting a major tasting for the law firm contract she was pursuing. The irony was perfect. While she was building her case for why they should hire her catering company, I was building my own case with someone who understood exactly how family members could exploit elderly relatives. Jim looked remarkably like Robert around the eyes, with the same kind smile and careful attention to detail that had made my husband such a good contractor. His office was lined with law books and family photos, including one of him and Robert at a baseball game they'd attended together just months before Robert's death. "Aunt Maggie," he said, standing to embrace me as I entered, "it's been too long. How are you holding up?" The genuine warmth in his greeting nearly made me cry. When was the last time someone had asked about my well-being as if the answer truly mattered to them? "I'm doing well, Jim, but I think I may have gotten myself into a situation I don't fully understand." We spent the first few minutes catching up on family news and shared memories of Robert. But when Jim asked how I was enjoying retirement, I found myself telling the truth in a way I hadn't with anyone except Helen. I explained how I'd helped Jessica rebuild her business, how I'd sold my house and moved in with her, and how our relationship had gradually shifted into something that felt more like employment than family. Jim listened with the careful attention of someone trained to hear what clients weren't quite saying directly. "Tell me about the financial arrangements," he said gently. "When you helped Jessica with her business, was there any documentation of loans or investment agreements?" "No," I admitted. "It was all informal. She was my daughter, and she was desperate. I never thought I'd need legal protection for my own child." Jim nodded with the expression of someone who'd heard similar stories too many times. "What about your current living situation?" he asked. "Do you pay rent? Are there written agreements about household responsibilities or expectations?" I described Jessica's typed list of rules, her restrictions on my use of common areas, her instructions to coordinate with the professional housekeeper she'd hired to replace my contributions.
And you said she's researching assisted living facilities? Sunset Manor, very expensive ones. I found the brochures in her office when I was looking for a phone charger. Jim was taking notes, but he looked up at that detail with sharp interest. How expensive, he asked. $6,000 a month or more. And you mentioned that Jessica's business is quite successful now? I told him about the financial documents I'd seen, the investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the thriving catering company that generated substantial monthly revenue. Jim set down his pen and looked at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and professionally focused. Maggie, what you're describing sounds like what we call financial exploitation of an elderly person. It's unfortunately more common than most people realize, and it often happens within families. But Jessica isn't stealing from me, I protested, though the words felt strange as I spoke them. She's not taking money from my accounts. Financial exploitation doesn't require theft in the traditional sense. It can include using an elderly person's resources without appropriate compensation, or creating living situations where the elderly person provides unpaid services while their contributions are systematically devalued. He opened a file drawer and pulled out several pamphlets. Let me ask you this. If Jessica were to hire someone to provide all the services you currently provide, cooking, cleaning, household management, coordination with other staff, what do you think that would cost her monthly? I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but as I considered the question, the answer was staggering. A live-in housekeeper in Jessica's neighborhood would cost at least $4,000 a month plus room and board. And you mentioned that Jessica's business is quite successful now. I told him about the financial documents I'd seen, the investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the thriving catering company that generated substantial monthly revenue. Jim set down his pen and looked at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and professionally focused. Maggie, what you're describing sounds like what we call financial exploitation of an elderly person. It's unfortunately more common than most people realize, and it often happens within families. But Jessica isn't stealing from me, I protested, though the words felt strange as I spoke them. She's not taking money from my accounts. And financial exploitation doesn't require theft in the traditional sense. It can include using an elderly person's resources without appropriate compensation, or creating living situations where the elderly person provides unpaid services while their contributions are systematically devalued. Let me ask you this. If Jessica were to hire someone to provide all the services you currently provide, cooking, cleaning, household management, coordination with other staff, what do you think that would cost her monthly? I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but as I considered the question, the answer was staggering. A live-in housekeeper in Jessica's neighborhood would cost at least $4,000 a month plus room and board. And you mentioned that Jessica's business is quite successful now. I told him about the financial documents I'd seen, the investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the thriving catering company that generated substantial monthly revenue. Jim set down his pen and looked at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and professionally focused. Maggie, what you're describing sounds like what we call financial exploitation of an elderly person. It's unfortunately more common than most people realize, and it often happens within families. But Jessica isn't stealing from me, I protested, though the words felt strange as I spoke them. She's not taking money from my accounts. And financial exploitation doesn't require theft in the traditional sense. It can include using an elderly person's resources without appropriate compensation, or creating living situations where the elderly person provides unpaid services while their contributions are systematically devalued. He opened a file drawer and pulled out several pamphlets. Let me ask you this. If Jessica were to hire someone to provide all the services you currently provide, cooking, cleaning, household management, coordination with other staff, What do you think that would cost her monthly? I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but as I considered the question, the answer was staggering. A live in housekeeper in Jessica's neighborhood would cost at least $4,000 a month, plus room and board. And you mentioned she's planning to move you to Sunset Manor at $6,000 monthly while she continues to benefit from the business success your financial contributions made possible? The way Jim framed it made the situation sound like a calculated business decision rather than the family drama I'd been experiencing it as. What are my options? I asked. Jim spent the next hour explaining concepts I'd never needed to understand before: restitution claims, constructive trusts, breach of fiduciary duty, financial abuse reporting procedures. None of it sounded pleasant, but all of it sounded like protection I should have sought months ago. The challenge, Jim said, is that family financial exploitation cases can be complex and emotionally difficult. Courts prefer to see documented agreements and clear evidence of intent to defraud. I don't want to destroy Jessica, I said quickly. I just want to be treated with basic respect and dignity. Of course. And often the threat of legal action is enough to bring family members to the negotiating table. People are usually more reasonable when they understand that their actions have potential legal consequences. Jim outlined several approaches, from informal mediation to formal legal proceedings. But he also suggested something I hadn't considered: documentation. If you decide to pursue this, it would be helpful to have a clear record of your contributions to Jessica's business success, the current value of her assets, and evidence of how your living situation has been structured to benefit her rather than you. You mean like keeping track of the household services I provide? Exactly. And any communications where she discusses your living situation, her plans for your future, or her financial status. The more documentation we have, the stronger your position becomes. As our meeting concluded, Jim handed me his business card and a packet of information about elder rights and family financial exploitation. Maggie, I want you to know that what you've described is not normal family dynamics. You're not being overly sensitive or ungrateful. You're being taken advantage of by someone who should be protecting you. Driving home from Jim's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the quiet confidence that comes from understanding your options. I wasn't ready to take legal action, not yet, but I was ready to start documenting exactly what my life in Jessica's house actually looked like when viewed through the lens of fair compensation and reasonable expectations. That evening, Jessica came home elated from her law firm tasting. "Mom, I think I nailed it," she announced, practically glowing with excitement. The senior partners were raving about the presentation, and the managing partner actually asked for my card for his daughter's wedding. I was genuinely happy for her success, even as I now understood how that success was built on a foundation she'd rather forget. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You've worked so hard for this." "I really have," she agreed, settling at the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner. "And you know what? I think this contract might finally give me the financial security to make some changes around here." My hands stilled on the vegetables I was chopping. "What kind of changes?" "Well, I've been thinking about your future, and I found some really nice senior living communities that might be perfect for you. Places where you could have your own space, but also have activities and meals provided. No more worrying about household responsibilities." Jessica was actually doing it. She was setting up the conversation about moving me to assisted living, framing it as a generous gift rather than an expensive way to remove an inconvenience. "That sounds interesting," I said carefully. When were you thinking about making this change? Oh, not immediately. Maybe in the next few months. I'd want to make sure we found the perfect place, somewhere really nice. Money wouldn't be an object, of course. Money wouldn't be an object because she'd be using money that had originally been mine to pay for housing that would remove me from her life while she continued to benefit from the business success my sacrifices made possible. Well, I said, returning to my chopping, that's certainly something to think about. What Jessica didn't know was that I was already thinking about it, just not in the way she imagined. I was thinking about documentation and legal options and the difference between generous family support and systematic exploitation. As I served dinner that night, Jessica chatted excitedly about her business plans and her vision for expanding into corporate catering. She was animated and confident, the picture of a successful entrepreneur who'd built something impressive through hard work and determination. And she had built something impressive. But as I watched her describe her achievements, I found myself wondering if she'd forgotten or chosen to forget exactly what foundation her success was built on. Later that evening, I sat in my bedroom and opened a new notebook I'd purchased after leaving Jim's office. On the first page, I wrote, Documentation. Margaret's household contributions, April 2025. Below that, I began listing everything I'd done that day: meal preparation, grocery shopping, coordination with Maria about cleaning schedules, laundry management, garden maintenance, general household organization. When I assigned reasonable hourly wages to each task, the daily total was substantial. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one more note. Jessica discussed moving me to assisted living in the next few months. Cost approximately $6,000 per month. Current value of household services provided, approximately $4,000 per month plus room and board. It was just documentation, I told myself, information I might never need to use. But as I closed the notebook and prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year: the quiet satisfaction of someone who understands exactly what their contributions are worth and has stopped accepting less than they deserve. The angel ornament from Brad caught the lamplight one more time, but tonight its shadows looked different. They looked like evidence. The gray housekeeper's uniform lay on the bed, a symbol of the life I'd been relegated to. I folded it carefully, my hands steady now, despite the shaking I'd felt when Jessica first tossed it at me. There was no room for tears anymore, only a cold clarity. My daughter had made her move, and now it was my turn. I'd spent too many years putting others first, too many years giving until I had nothing left to give. But now something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just her mother. I wasn't just someone to clean her house, to cook her meals, to disappear into the background of her perfect life. I had built her empire. I had given her everything. And she thought she could push me aside like an inconvenience. I hadn't forgotten those early days when she needed me most, when her world was falling apart and I was the one who stepped in to hold it all together. I hadn't forgotten the promises she had made, the way she had told me everything would be temporary. I had believed her. I had trusted her. But no more. I moved to the living room, my mind racing as I prepared myself. My feet were firm on the ground now. Jessica didn't know it, but I had been quietly observing her every move, learning everything about her business, her finances, and most importantly, her lies. She thought she was just some old woman, content to stay out of sight and out of mind. But I had been paying attention. I'd seen the document she carelessly left lying around. I'd overheard the conversation she didn't think I could hear, and I knew what she was hiding. The moment she walked in, I could hear the familiar sound of her busy schedule, the constant meetings, the pressure of her growing business. But today, that noise felt different. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't ignore anymore. I was waiting for her, and when she appeared in the doorway, I knew it was time.
Mom, are you okay? She asked, her voice laced with that fake concern she always put on when she needed something from me. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I let the silence hang in the air, thick with the weight of everything I had learned, everything she didn't know I knew. Mom? She repeated, her voice faltering a little now, seeing the look on my face. You've been so busy lately, Jessica, I said slowly, my voice calm but firm. Too busy to spend any real time with me, haven't you? Her face tightened, her eyes shifting nervously. I've told you, I've been overwhelmed with work. You know how it is. This business isn't easy. I nodded, though the sting of her words cut deeper than she knew. I know exactly how it is, I said quietly. But there's something you don't know, Jessica. You think you've been running the show, but you've underestimated me. She scoffed, a dismissive laugh escaping her lips. What are you talking about, Mom? You're just upset because I've been busy. You know I don't have time to sit around and entertain you all day. I took a deep breath, the air thick in my lungs, and I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in a long while. The daughter I had given everything for, the daughter I had sacrificed my own life for. You've been busy, yes, busy building your life on the foundation I helped build for you, busy turning everything I gave you into your personal empire. But what you don't know is that I've been watching. I've been learning. Her eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? I walked slowly towards her, my footsteps steady, each one echoing louder than the last. I've seen your bank statements, Jessica. I've seen the business contracts you've signed, the investments you've made. I know how much money you've been making, how much you've been hiding from me. And I know that you've been pretending that everything you have is from your hard work, when in reality, it was built on the money I gave you, on the house I sold, on the life savings I drained to help you rebuild your business after your divorce. Her face paled, but she recovered quickly, trying to regain control. What are you talking about? You helped me, yes, but I've worked for everything I have. I don't owe you anything more. I shook my head slowly. You owe me more than you can ever understand, Jessica. You don't see me. You never have. And you've convinced yourself that because I'm older, because I'm your mother, that I don't matter. But that's where you're wrong. You've been treating me like hired help in my own home. Her eyes flashed with annoyance, but there was something else there now. Fear. She could feel it shifting in the room. The balance of power was changing, and she knew it. I didn't ask you to move in. You wanted to help. Well, I don't need it anymore. She snapped, her voice rising. I wasn't fazed. I'd heard it all before, and I was done being afraid of her. No, Jessica, you don't need me. You never did. You needed someone to make everything look perfect, someone who wouldn't ask for anything in return, someone to cook your meals, clean your house, play the role of the invisible mother. And I played that part for you because I thought I was helping. But now I see the truth. You don't need me in your life at all. You've been using me all along.
Her silence spoke volumes, the tension in the air so thick I could cut it with a knife. I had her now. You think I don't see what's been going on behind my back? You think I don't know about the retirement home brochures you've been researching, planning to move me out of here while keeping all of my contributions to your success a secret? You've been so busy securing your future that you forgot to care about mine. I let the words sink in, watching as the walls she'd built around herself began to crumble. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Let's not pretend anymore, Jessica. You don't get to control the narrative anymore. The truth is out. You've been treating me like a burden for too long, but I'm done playing along. I took a step back, my heart racing. It was done. Jessica was silent, her face pale, her lips trembling as the weight of everything she'd done hit her. Her empire was built on lies, and I had just shown her that I knew everything. She was no longer in control. The silence hung between us like a heavy fog. Jessica stood frozen, her face pale, eyes wide, unable to form words. She thought I was weak, that I was a woman too old, too small, too tired to notice the lies she'd been spinning around me for years. But now, in the silence of that moment, she knew everything I had seen, the truth I had finally uncovered. I didn't need to speak anymore. The weight of my words, the documents I had in my hand, and the quiet confidence I now carried, they all spoke for me. I think you should leave, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. I can't deal with this right now. I nodded slowly, my heart no longer aching for her. It had broke too many times before, and this time I knew the path forward wasn't going to be about fixing us. Not anymore. This was my time to fix me.
I turned and walked toward the door without looking back. There was no anger in me, no bitterness, just peace. Because for the first time in years, I had regained control of my life, and that was all that mattered. I left Jessica's house, my sanctuary no longer, the house I had built her, the one I had poured my love, my savings, my life into, was no longer my home. But I wasn't lost anymore. I had a new home now, a home in myself, a home of dignity I had forgotten how to claim. The streets outside Jessica's house were quieter than I remembered, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. The daffodils in Jessica's garden I had planted months ago had bloomed, their yellow heads bright against the cold gray sky. It was ironic, really. Those daffodils were thriving, and I had left behind the home where I had spent so many mornings caring for them, where I had poured my love into the soil, tending it like a second family. And yet here I was, a new beginning, just as they were. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I didn't need to. The weight in my chest had lifted, and I felt something in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real hope. I spent the next few days in a quiet frenzy of reclaiming my life. I didn't rush it. I didn't need to. The decisions I made, where to go, who to talk to, what to do next,
felt like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The first step was clear. I called Helen, my old friend, the one person who had always known me and never judged me. Maggie, I'm so glad you called. Helen's voice was warm, familiar. I don't know how much I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up? I smiled, letting out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I'm all right, Helen. Actually, I'm better than all right. I just needed to talk to someone who really knows me. I'm here, Maggie. You always have a place with me. It felt like the first time in months that I was truly seen. I spent hours with Helen, catching up, laughing, talking about everything and nothing. It was just what I needed. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe, like I wasn't trapped in a life that wasn't mine to begin with. Over the next few weeks, I began to carve out my new space in the world. It wasn't about revenge or making Jessica pay. I had already made her face the consequences of her actions. This was about me reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I didn't need her money or her approval or even her presence. What I needed was to find myself again. One afternoon, I drove past Sunset Manor, the luxury retirement community Jessica had researched for me. As I approached the gates, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This place wasn't my future. It never had been. My future wasn't about living out my days in a place built for people who felt like they had nothing left to give. My future was about living with purpose on my terms. I didn't even stop to see the brochures or go inside. I had made my decision long before. Days turned into weeks, and I started to get my feet underneath me again. I found a small apartment, one that was cozy and comfortable, with a view of the park across the street. It wasn't the condo Jessica had promised me, but it was mine. I filled it with the things I loved: the antique lamp Robert had bought me on our first anniversary, the paintings I collected over the years, the smell of fresh coffee brewing every morning. I hadn't realized how much I had missed the simple joys of living on my own. Jessica didn't call. I hadn't expected her to. And I wasn't about to reach out to her either. What had we left to say to each other? My daughter has stolen more from me than just money. She'd taken my sense of self-worth. But I have found it again. In the quiet moments of reflection, in the daily rituals I'd created for myself, in the realization that I didn't need her permission to live a full and happy life. I thought about her sometimes, especially when I passed the garden we'd once worked on together. It made me sad to know that she was likely enjoying the fruits of my labor, oblivious to the fact that I had once nurtured it with my hands. But then I would remind myself that her success, built on my sacrifices, wasn't the point anymore. The point was that I had survived, I had loved, and now I was free. One evening, as the sun set behind my little apartment, casting long shadows across the room, I opened the notebook I kept hidden away for months, the one where I had written down all the moments I had quietly observed, the moments when I was invisible, And yet, when I knew more than anyone could have ever guessed, I wrote one more line in the book, then closed it with a deep breath. I am not invisible anymore. The phone rang one day, and I almost didn't answer it, but something told me I should. Hello? Maggie. It was Helen's voice again. I'm just calling to check in. How you doing? Really? I'm doing just fine, Helen, I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. Better than I've been in a long time. And for the first time in years, I believed it. There was a new peace in my life, a quiet understanding that I had taken back control, not from Jessica, not from anyone, but from myself. As I hung up the phone, I walked to the window and looked out at the daffodils blooming in the park across the street. The world was full of new beginnings if you were brave enough to see them. She taught me that people shouldn't depend on their kid after retirement because your kid can be your greatest enemy and biggest decision you ever made.